Hello, I'm Tim Smith with the Adams County Historical Society, and welcome to another edition of Monuments Monday. And again, we're on Cemetery Ridge along Hancock Avenue, where there is just a plethora of monuments. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the angle, or the high water mark of the rebellion. And we call it the angle because the stone wall that was sort of a boundary for this property prior to the war actually makes a 90-degree angle up there and then descends to the west, and there's probably about a 10-foot drop, and then creates another angle where that single tree and monument to the 71st Pennsylvania are, and runs out along there. And according to the Southern accounts, this was a perceived weak spot in the Union line on July 3rd. The Union line running along that wall and running up along that wall, but with no troops in the intervening east-west wall. And also near this spot was a copse of trees or clump of trees that would be used to guide the Southern attack on. On July 3rd, 1863, some 12,000 Southerners came across this field and were devastated by the Union fire along this ridge. And, when we're out on the battlefield and we talk about these things, I think most visitors to Gettysburg are surprised to learn that we really don't have many Southern memorials. Of the over 1,500 monuments, markers, and tablets on the Gettysburg National Military Park, only about 20 of them were placed by Southern states. And a couple things I noticed about this is, one thing, people are surprised that we don't have more Southern monuments. I think people expect to see Southern monuments when they come here, and are also surprised to learn that it was the Northern veterans that kept Southerners from placing monuments at Gettysburg. I think there's a tendency to look back on the Civil War and the years after the Civil War when the veterans were putting up monuments, and imagine that the Northern and Southern veterans, got along, that our nation pulled together after the Civil War, and the troubles behind us were solved, and there was a sense of reunion. And that might be true to a certain extent, but I think we romanticize it when we go back and we highlight the reunions between the blue and the gray. But during the years that the Northern veterans controlled the battlefield, there simply were not Southern monuments. And it wasn't that the Northern veterans didn't want to tell the story of the Southern Army at the battle. The War Department came in and put up informational tablets and plaques to the various units of the Southern Army involved in the battle. But those plaques and tablets do not honor the Southern soldiers or their cause. And the Northern veterans were very adamant about it. Just for instance, during the 1913 reunion, Confederate flags were not allowed to be carried by the Confederate veterans. I think people are surprised to hear that. And there are very few true Southern monuments on the battlefield placed by Southern states. And one of the first was the marker to General Lewis Armistead, placed here inside the angle in 1888. And, it is besides the advanced position marker of the Maryland troops on Culp's Hill, it is the only Southern monument inside the Union lines at Gettysburg. And of course, General Lewis Armistead led the spearhead of Pickett's division, sort of a second wave, as he came up and over the stone wall and made it inside the Northern lines. Some of you may know I'm from Baltimore. I had a great-grandfather at Fort McHenry. And the commander of Fort McHenry during the War of 1812 was George Armistead. And after the 25-hour British bombardment on the fort, George Armistead raised a flag over that fort. And miles away, Francis Scott Key saw that flag and wrote that poem that eventually became our national anthem. But to Baltimoreans, that has always been more. Prior to that moment in our country's history, we seem to be a loose collection of individual states. But the defeat of the British at Baltimore and the victory during the War of 1812 and the raising of that flag pulled our country together and made us what we are today. And here at Gettysburg, 50 years later, his nephew, George Armistead's nephew, Lewis, is leading a charge to destroy our country and tear it apart once again. And he's killed leading that charge. And I would say that's the tragedy of the American Civil War. Can you imagine men like Armistead, who served in the United States Army all his life, having to make a decision when the country was torn apart and go with the Southerners and fight against the flag and the symbol that his uncle created? Armistead was mortally wounded. He died at a farmhouse behind the lines. And a few weeks after the battle, his cousin obtained the body. And today, Lewis Armistead is buried in St. Paul's Cemetery in Baltimore in the same crypt with his more famous uncle. You know, speaking of the Armistead marker, I thought it might be interesting to give you a few details. I mentioned that it was placed in 1888, but you might look on the internet and see there's some dispute about when the monument was placed. So let me try to clarify it. In 1884, the minutes of the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association mention that the resident committee is instructed to have a mark the position where General Armistead fell. In May of 1887, a committee representing Pickett's Division Association appeared before the board and requested permission to erect a monument to said division on the spot where Armistead fell. And eventually, the Philadelphia Brigade veterans get involved in this. On July 12, 1887, the minutes for the GBMA mention that the Committee on Location and Colonel Batchelder will be authorized to mark with a suitable tablet the spot where Lewis Armistead of the Confederate Army fell mortally wounded July 3, 1863, in accordance with the action of the association adopted in October of 1884. Now, I noticed on the internet database Stone Sentinels, they give July 12, 1887 as a date of dedication, but that's when they decided they would start the memorial. And we know in April 1888, the minutes mention that they pay $165 to Thomas Nan for the Armistead marker. Now, on January 10th, 1888, there's an article in the Gettysburg compiler that states that along with this, meaning this shipment coming up, will come the 12th New Hampshire Regiment's fine monument and a tablet ordered by the Memorial Association to mark the spot where General Armistead fell inside the Union lines in lead of Pickett's charge. So it's definitely not there in January 1888. They're waiting for the monument's arrival. And there's actually an article in the Baltimore Sun in January 1888, and it mentions the marker contracted by the Memorial Association to mark the spot where General Armistead fell mortally wounded. It's on its way from Concord, New Hampshire. And again, it's coming from there because it was made by the same man who made the 12th New Hampshire monument. And then finally, there's an article in the Richmond newspaper on January 23rd, 1888, and it says, The tablet with which the Memorial Association marks the spot where General Armistead fell inside the bloody angle at the head of Pickett's division was placed in position on Gettysburg on Monday. And from the date of the paper, this would be January 23rd when they actually put up the monument, the article being January 29th. The problem is we have a few more articles in February that mention that they received the monument and it's still not yet in place. So if you buy the Richmond article, it went up on January 23rd, and we know it's up by April 1888. So that's why I said 1888. Thanks for watching. And if you like the content that we put on our YouTube channel, please like and subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you can learn of our upcoming videos.